What if the Pilgrims had landed not in 1620 but centuries earlier? Who would have hailed them on the shores of Cape Cod or Plymouth? If your answer is one of the many Algonquian tribes who ruled the Eastern Seaboard at the time of European contact, peoples such as the Massachusetts or Narragansetts, you'd be wrong. In AD 1000, the residents of what is now New England and New Jersey and Washington, D.C. weren't Algonquins or Europeans, but somebody else. Their identity has been a mystery until now. My name is Nathaniel Jeanson. I'm the research biologist with Answers in Genesis, and this is the Lost History of North America. If you're watching this and you're one of the Native American or First Nation tribes in the United States and Canada, stick with me to the end. I've got a special request for your help that you'll see here in a moment. But back to this question. If you're Caucasian American, if you've grown up with a mainstream history and you have trouble giving up the thought that surely the Indians with whom the Pilgrims shared the first Thanksgiving in 1621 would have been the same Native Americans who were there centuries prior, I wouldn't fault you. We've grown accustomed to thinking about pre-Columbian, pre-European North America as a static place. We've also grown accustomed to thinking about pre-Columbian North America as an empty place with few inhabitants. The reality was very different. So to see a map like this, which is a map of North America at the time of European contact, to see a map where nearly the entire continent is filled with peoples, may be a bit jarring to what you and I grew up with. At the time of contact, North America was filled with a dizzying array of language groups and people groups who built great structures and empires and who were frequently on the move. From the earliest times, archaeologically, we can see that great builders thrived in North America. One of the more spectacular builders, around 1000 BC, were those who built Poverty Point in modern Louisiana. You can't see it very well at this level of zooming, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. My apologies for the graininess of this, but I want you to see just how much these people built. You can see the larger temple-like structure mound back here, and then a series of what looks like concentric rings. It's estimated that over 1,000 adults would have taken over 6 months to complete this, and that's working every day. Over a millennium after this, about 250 AD, another mound-building culture arose known as the Hopewell culture that created a different set of mounds. I've been able to visit a number of these because the epicenter of this culture was in Ohio, just north of me here in northern Kentucky. What's spectacular about this group was that the mounds they built, the structures they built, the earthworks they built were astronomically significant, as in aligned with the moon. They were geometrically precise, and I want to point out some of those structures here. You can see there's a circle that's an earthwork. This is sort of an octagonal structure. This is still in existence. It's owned by a golf course, or it's part of a golf course. All you can do right now, because it's privately owned, is to go up a little platform to view it, but it's something to see. There's this earthwork I'll show you images of here in a moment that is quite impressive. A number of these passageways and earthworks are now gone because of modern development, as are a large number of earthworks that were built around this time. But those that remain are quite spectacular. They really have to be experienced, and I can't quite convey it to you with images, but I'm going to try. This is the outside of one of these circular mounds. So one of the best to see in Ohio Newark is this one right here, this circular one. There's an opening, an entrance right there. But outside of it, you can see there's this picnic bench for scale. If you're standing up, you can't see into it. Or if you're inside of it, you can't see out. Here's the entrance. You can't even see the back of it. It's this large, it's almost like this massive stadium or amphitheater with another little mound in here. You picture a large group of Native Americans in here for some sort of event, and it almost gives you chills because it's so impressive. You'll notice, though, what I've said so far, Poverty Point, Hopewell, none of these are names that we're familiar with. Names like Delaware or Sioux or Navajo or Shawnee. There's a big disconnect between archaeology and those groups that we found at contact. Part of the reason for this disconnect is an event or a series of events that we can detect genetically. This particular tree that you're looking at is based on the DNA of 600 men. And men, because one of the main tools we've been using, if you've been with us before in previous episodes, is the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. So this particular tree of 600 men is from men around the globe. For our purposes, the branches that we want to look at, and the letters and numbers are just standard conventions for navigating the tree, semi-arbitrary, and they're labels. Q is one of the more dominant branches to which Native Americans belong once you subtract away the European branches and African branches due to recent European colonialism or the recent transatlantic slave trade. Once those are removed, this is the dominant one that remains. The size of these circles represents the relative abundance. So among the Navajos, for example, more than 90% of Navajo men, based on published studies, belong to this branch. This arrived in the Americas in the 300s to 600s AD. So at the same time that the Huns were leaving Central Asia and invading the Roman Empire, leading eventually to its downfall, there was another group of Central Asians that apparently came across the Bering Strait or somewhere from Central Asia over to the Americas, rapidly dispersed in the Americas, and ended up dominating, perhaps leading to the downfall of the Mayan Empire at that time. There's another group that's in the Americas, another branch that's in the Americas at lower levels. It's this branch known as C, or haplogroup, is the technical term. This also came from Central Asia. This, though, was later, around the 900s AD. It tends to be more concentrated in North America, especially in Canada. This was also a time at which Central Asians were on the move towards Europe in the other direction. Much of Europe, Eastern and Western, derives from Middle Ages era migrations from Central Asia. My own Y chromosome derives from this a migration around this time. After the arrival of these people, or around the same time, another group of mound builders produced structures we can still see to this day. In fact, some of the most spectacular earthworks, this is from Cahokia, around modern St. Louis, were built post-dating that period. Cahokia's fluorescence was in the AD 1000s and 1200s. It was the greatest city north of the Rio Grande in the pre-Columbian era. It was as big as London in its day. So all this together shows us that there were at least 3 settlings of North America. And this is in the background to our larger question of who was here on the Eastern Seaboard in AD 1000. Who would the Pilgrims have encountered had they left Europe several centuries earlier? The first settling of North America, and there may have been more than one, was those who gave rise to the mound building cultures, Poverty Point 1000 AD. Eden I didn't mention, but they were in the BC era, Hopewell around the BC to AD transition. So that may have been one or more migrations. Genetically, we can see there was another migration, the AD 300s to 600s. And then the third is the 8900s. So as I showed, we've got genetics for the third migration, genetics for the second migration. We do not yet have, or we've not yet been able to discover the genetic echo of the first migration. This is actually one of the goals of the project moving forward. Can we find it? Now, if you've been with us in this series, you know that we've begun to connect specific migrations to specific people groups. We've begun to bridge the gap between the archaeology and the labels, the academic labels that have been assigned to various cultures, and connect them to modern descendants. And we've been able to do it with genetics. We've been able to connect some of the later mound-building cultures to specific people groups. Yet in the background of all this is this outstanding mystery that'll be relevant in today's topic as to who gave rise to the earliest peoples. Do they have modern descendants today? We're going to go back to the time of contact to think through this question. At contact, yes, when the Pilgrims landed, there were Algonquian peoples in New England. But we know, and you can see this in previous episodes, in 1000 AD, several centuries prior, the Algonquans were not there. They were not the people that the Pilgrims would have encountered had they arrived several centuries prior. How do we know this is true? Again, we'll have the links in the description to the previous episodes, but from a combination of archaeology, genetics, and especially indigenous history, we know that the Algic peoples, of which the Algonquans are a subset, arrived in the Americas about the 900s AD. That haplogroup C, or that branch C, represents the Algic Algonquin branch, their migration. They had a spectacular migration from Alaska down western part of Canada, across the Great Plains, eventually to the Eastern Seaboard. They were the ones who overthrew Cahokia, some of the greatest battles and warriors of the pre-Columbian era. Again, you can find this in our YouTube channel. We've got a playlist, Lost History of North America, where we go through in a couple different episodes the account of the Algic peoples, the full picture of their migration and their relationship to the builders of Cahokia, the greatest city north of the Rio Grande. Even that we can now connect to a specific group. The Natchez apparently are the best candidates for having built this great empire. But if it wasn't the Muskogeans who were on the Eastern Seaboard in 1000 AD, who was? Could it have been peoples like the Muskogeans? They're not here at contact on the Atlantic or even New England, but they are eastern woodlands peoples, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creeks, and others. We've seen in previous episodes, they themselves say they came from Mexico and rapidly fled to avoid being enslaved by the Spanish and arrived in the southeast of the United States in the 1500s. That's too late to be on the Eastern Seaboard in AD 1000, so by process of elimination, we know they wouldn't have been there as well. Again, you can see that story in a previous episode. So who was here? Which people group was on the Atlantic in AD 1000 when the Europeans were in their Middle Ages? What was going on in North America? At contact, this is how it looked. Again, the tan-colored here, stripes. They were here, the Algonquins are here at contact, but I just told you they weren't here in 1000 AD. Muskogeans weren't either. I don't yet have good data to tell you about the history of the Iroquois. So who's left? What candidates are there to have been on the Eastern Seaboard in 1000 AD? If Thanksgiving happened in AD 1000, who would have been there? You might notice, so the Iroquoians are in this pinkish red color. Blue, this purplish blue right here, is also close to the east. Who are they? And could they have had any relevance in 1000 AD to our question? Well, this is the Sioux and Catawban language family, of which the most famous tend to be the Lakotas and others. And for many Americans, Caucasian Americans, they think Sioux and they think of the Great Plains, buffalo hunts, wide open, treeless prairies, a lifestyle based on teepees. They tend not to think of vast forests, dense forests, lifestyles based on hunting deer rather than hunting buffalo, lifestyles in which you live in wigwams for shelter, not teepees. That's not typically associated with the Sioux in many people's minds. But it's worth asking, who were the ancestors of the famous Sioux chieftains, the warriors, the Red Cloud, and Sitting Bull and others? We think of them as being on the Great Plains, because that's where many of the 1800s battles were. But where did their ancestors come from? And could they have been on the East Coast centuries prior to the 1800s? Even in the post-contact era, we know there was significant movement, that the Lakotas and others moved on to the prairies post-1600s. There were other Siouans in Minnesota, so the Lakotas and others moved onto the prairies from Minnesota. The Santee Sioux and others were in Minnesota. The Santee were on the move because there were pressure on them from the Ojibways, who had acquired weapons from Europeans up here by Hudson Bay. So there was this domino effect in a sense. Now someone might say, sure, Europeans come in and they completely upend the equilibrium. You can't take post-contact events and extrapolate into the past. Can we? Is rapid, widespread movement just a recent invention? Or is that what people do all around the globe? And so that would have been a part of pre-Columbian North America as well. To answer that question, I want to turn our attention first to linguistics. I'm going to explore multiple angles to this question to try to uncover the deeper history of the Sioux and Catawban language family, and the bigger question of whether or not they would have been on the East Coast in AD 1000. And of course, behind all of these questions is who gave rise to some of the earliest mound-building cultures, and might the Sioux have had a connection there as well? I'm going to change the map here. This comes from Wikipedia. We'll have better maps in the future, but this gets pretty close to what you'll find in the academic literature. Just to give us a sense, in case you're not familiar with who the members of this family are, I mentioned the Lakotas, again, tend to be the more well-known, but there are many others in this language family. Crows might be familiar. The Dakotas might be familiar. I grew up in Wisconsin, so Winnebagos were familiar to me. There were the Omaha, the Ponca, Hidatsa, Mandan, Assiniboines. There is a group up in Canada, the Stoney, going the other direction. Others that might be perhaps more familiar to you, the Osage, the Kansa, the Kapaw, and you're going to see different spellings. We're going to go through some of the older literature where they spell it differently as well. The Chuere include the Iowa, the Oto, the Missouri, and of course you've just heard a number of names for U.S. states drawn from the Native American names. There was a group down in the along the Gulf of Mexico and Mississippi, the Biloxi. Closer to the Eastern Seaboard were the Catawbans, the Tutelos, the Saponis, and others. What could linguistics tell us about the origins and migration of the Sioux and Catawban peoples? You may not be able to see the details of this diagram. This is a diagram of the language relationships among these peoples. And I'm following the Ethnologue, which is an academic resource connected to the Wycliffe Bible translators. They have an academic arm known as the Summer Institute of Linguistics. They publish this yearly resource. This classification is not that far off from another academic source. Campbell wrote a book on Native American languages in 1997. And you don't need to see the details because I'm going to show you on the map then the hierarchy among these languages and then what it implies for who originated when and where. And the answer may surprise you. So if you compare the languages to one another and you ask the question, which language seems to be the most divergent, which is the deepest split, as if this was the group that formed first, the answer would be the Catawban languages, which are found out here. Among the group that remains, which are all still in this royal blue color, what's the next deepest split? And that would be the Crow, the Hidatsa, and the Mandan. And I've got two different colors here because they form a separate subgrouping, and within that grouping there are splits that happen linguistically later. Of the blue that remains, the next division is the Tutelos and others, closer to the Eastern Seaboard. And the last major linguistic division among these royal blue, which all kind of are clustered along or on the western side of the Mississippi River, are the Lakota and the Dakota and the Winnebagos and the Otos and Missouris and Osages and others. There's sort of a four-fold division here. This is a group. The Winnebagos and the Chueres are one group, and then the Dakotas, Lakotas, Assiniboines, and Stonies are another group. Fine, there's a hierarchy. What does that matter? What history is embedded in that? Well, think about how languages form. And this is one of many hypotheses you could invoke to explain this, but I think it's a good starting point. If you want languages to diverge, you can't have people living in the same area interacting, trading, communicating, because they're going to keep speaking the same language. You need someone to migrate away from the main group and to be isolated where the languages can continue to develop and diversify unconstrained by the need to communicate with the parent group. So then if we go through this cycle again, the sequence of the hierarchy, if this is the first division, and this is where they were found at contact, we should ask the question, how would you isolate this group? And presumably to isolate that group, you need to have the parent group somewhere else. Now, it's theoretically possible that the Sioux and Catawban ancestors were all in California, and they just kept sending people east. That seems to invoke a lot of migrations. I'm going to take a minimalistic approach, saying, okay, how do we minimize the amount of geographic distance just to have a starting point to figure out where the homelands of these people may have been linguistically? Well, if the Catawbans were here and they were a deep division, and presumably they migrated away from the parent group and stayed away from the parent group, well, presumably the parent group was somewhere else. So not here. Where else could they be? Again, I'm going to try to minimize the distance required to travel for the other groups. So perhaps somewhere right here would minimize that distance, and so put a distance between the parent and the breakaway group, yet minimize the amount of distance the rest of the groups have to eventually travel. We'll repeat this process again to see how this changes for the second division. Among those who remain, the Crows, the Hidatsas, the Mandan, they would have presumably have migrated away for their languages to develop and diversify. Again, I think it's a good approximation that allows them a distance to migrate away, to diversify, to develop differences, to become different languages. Same song, third verse. For this this split right here, again, I don't think we can put the homelands here or out here. It's somewhere perhaps between them. Shift this slightly, perhaps more towards Illinois. I think that's a good position to allow then the fourfold split for the last linguistic step. All this, again, is a working hypothesis, but I think it makes sense of what we see, and the bigger conclusion I want you to see is it implies, in origin, at least east of the Mississippi. Interesting. We think, again, you may have grown up thinking about the Lakotas and others as being on the Great Plains. Linguistically, there seems to be a link east of the Mississippi. Okay. Well, where else can we go for information? There isn't yet published, publicly available genetic data for members of the Sioux and Catawban language family in any sort of detail. We'll come back to that at the end of this talk. But we do have another source of information that is extremely valuable and gives tremendous insights and surprises to this history, and it's based on Indigenous history. Now, the typical academic attitude towards Indigenous history is to dismiss it and treat it as mythological or forgeries even. And if you've been with us in previous episodes, you know that we've taken perhaps the most infamous example of that practice, the Red Record or the Wallam Olam of the Delawares. This has been rejected explicitly by the academic community. They've been so persuasive that the Delawares themselves have rescinded their endorsement of this document as authentic. Yet what we've seen is that this document that came to the public knowledge in the early 1800s, if you read through it and you reconstruct the history, it anticipated genetic discoveries a century and a half later. How could a forgery, some sort of mythological document, be so good it could anticipate genetic discoveries 150 years in the future? I don't think a forgery can. A real history, though, could. And again, I go through this. You can see the links in the description in previous episodes. So my attitude, given what I've found with this history, is to, as a first approximation, assume all the Indigenous histories are true, unless we have compelling reason otherwise. And I've had Native Americans tell me, hey, you can trust this guy. He documented our history well. This guy over here, though, was not very rigorous in his practice. He'd reward children with candy if they'd tell him a story. And so kids being kids will make up stories to get candy. So you can't trust necessarily what he said, and all that's valuable to know. But as a general rule, if we have what the Indigenous people say is their history, I assume it's true. Let's walk through it. And I think what you'll see as we walk through this is, and what's been very exciting for me, is we're going to see the Indigenous histories interact with one another and agree. So if these histories are mythological, they're made up, or they're exaggerated, how come they tell the same story? How can they agree? I don't think you can do that except if they're both independently true. In previous episodes, I've given the references. I'll do the same thing here. For sake of time, I'm just going to give you brief quotes, but I'm being transparent about where it comes from. Page numbers, you can look up the full context and decide for yourself if I've accurately represented what they said and if whether or not what they say is true or believable. But I'm assuming it is true, and I'm putting it up here for your evaluation. This comes from Dorsey. He had an article, Migrations of the Siouan Tribes in 1886, and I especially value some of the older documents because they're just going out there and documenting what they say without any influence of modern discoveries. It's what they thought at the time, and for that reason, I think it's especially reliable. So Dorsey says, the Jesuit relation of 1640 speaks of the Dakotas and the Assiniboines, placing them in the neighborhood of the Winnebagos. This last nation was probably in the region of Green Bay in 1614 when Champlain met 8 of their men. And just to preview where we're going with this, I'm going to be building up the Sioux history step by step based on what they said to see if it gets us anywhere close to the Eastern Seaboard in 1000 AD. And I think what we'll discover is something rather exciting. So the Dakotas, the Assiniboines, I'm going to take all these quotes and put them on the map for us. We're going to build up this map, this history on the map. And he says they were in the neighborhood of the Winnebagos and in Green Bay. So Green Bay, if you're not from Wisconsin like I am, is up this way, Packerland now. And what Dorsey tells us is that the Dakotas, the Assiniboines, said they came from that direction. Sure, later at contact, they're found in Minnesota, Dakotas, even into Canada. But in the 1600s, apparently were residing out this direction. Interesting. That's not East Coast, but it's movement. It's dynamic. Keating in 1825 says the Assiniboines, again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but you've got the references. The Assiniboines have been fighting the Dakotas ever since their separation, but there seems to be at present a mutual tendency to a reunion. Their present chief rose by his military achievements. His name is Menayoka, and forgive me if I've mispronounced this, knife bearer. The cause of the separation of the Assiniboines from their former friends is variously related. The following has appeared to us to be the prevalent tradition on the subject. It is said that about 50 years ago, and there's an asterisk because either the publisher or the author himself didn't apparently believe this. He said the separation probably occurred in a much earlier period. Dates are soon forgotten by the Indians. That's his attitude. I'm going to take it straight forward because I think they have preserved their history. Again, the publication date is 1825, so 50 years from that date, 1825 minus 50 would be 1775. It is said that about 50 years ago, 1775, a quarrel arose between two influential families of the Yanktonans. And it goes on with much more detail that I don't have time to get into. You can look it up again. I think this is publicly available as a PDF online, archive.org. Suffice it to say that the breach widened, the nation was divided, a long and bloody civil war ensued. The aggressor and his friends withdrew to the north. The Assiniboines ceased to pay any allegiance to the Confederacy and formed a new nation. So, we know from another quote they were back here. Apparently there was a quarrel, and they left to go this direction, and the date is around the 1700s, which again fits because we had the other document saying in the 1600s they were over here. Back to Dorsey, 1886. About 3 years ago, the Iowa chiefs who visited Washington at that time, which I think in context of what Dorsey is writing may have been about 1883, told the writer that their people, the Otos, Missouris, Omahas, Poncas, once formed part of the Winnebago Nation. We're going to come back to this because there's a quote here and then a different quote where there seems to be a bit of an inconsistency. The Omahas and Poncas are part of a separate language subdivision from the Winnebagos, the Otos, and the Missouris, but it may simply indicate that there was a more complex history than I'm able to reconstruct at the present. This quote says these 5 groups were once together, so I think we can add that to our map. It doesn't yet say where they came from, but Omahas, Poncas, the Iowas, and Otos were part of the Chihuahuas here on the map. If you can't read it, again, I've zoomed in the previous slides. You can go back in the video. Winnebagos were all once together. Well, where? Dorsey goes on to say, Iowas, Otos, Missouris, Omahas, and Poncas have a tradition that, at a distant epoch, they, together with the Winnebagos, came from the north. That the Winnebagos stopped on the banks of Lake Michigan, while the rest, continuing their course southerly, crossed the Mississippi River and occupied places in which they were found by the Europeans, which, of course, the Mississippi River splits the center of the United States, basically begins up here in Minnesota. So if they came from the north, the Winnebagos stop here, and the rest of them keep continuing across the Mississippi. That puts them down here, which, of course, you'll see on the map is close to where they were at contact. Winnebagos stopped the banks of Lake Michigan. So I just read that. The others crossed the Mississippi River. Now we can change the diagram from simply saying, yeah, they were connected, to saying, now we know where they came from. They were once together and came from the north. So perhaps Canada, perhaps the Upper Peninsula up here in Michigan. We're heading south. Winnebagos stayed here. The others, the Omahas, Poncas, Chihuahuas, continued to cross the Mississippi River, which forms part of the western border of Wisconsin, of course, begins in Minnesota. And at the time of contact, they're out here, closer to the plains on the western part of the Mississippi River. More from Dorsey. Ages ago, the ancestors of the Omahas, Poncas, Osages, Kansas, Kapaws, Winnebagos, all those are Sioux and Catawban language family members, but then also the Pawnee Loups or the Skiddy and Rees, which I think is another term for the Arikaras. Those are Caddoans, separate language family, who were at contact west of the Mississippi River. So more on those hopefully in a future episode. Dynamic history. Dwelt east of the Mississippi River. All these groups, they were not all in one region, but they were allies, and their general course was westward. And this nugget right here is something we're going to return to in a future episode. They drove other tribes before them. Who were they? So, just to point out the groups, there was a long list of them, so we can see them on the map. The Omahas, the Poncas, the Osage, the Kansa, the Kapaw, and Winnebagos. That's who we're talking about. It says those guys dwelt east of the Mississippi, and their general course was westward. Again, there's the Mississippi, border of Illinois, Missouri, and so on. So these guys who had contact were west of the Mississippi. There's Illinois border. These guys were east, but they were once all together, and they were east of the Mississippi. Where? Well, we'll just put that general region, we'll shade that to designate they were east of the Mississippi. And they moved westward. Now, 5 of these peoples, the Omahas, Poncaws, Osages, Kansas, and Kapaws, were then together as one nation, and those do form a language subdivision, the Dagia subdivision. They were called the Arkansas or Alkansa by the Illinois tribes, and they dwelt near the Ohio River. So that gives us more geographic precision. At the mouth of the Ohio, a separation occurred. So I'm going to change the map. Notice that this is a group of 5. We aren't talking about the Winnebagos anymore. There was an association at some point east of the Mississippi, but the group that moved together along the Ohio and separated at the mouth of the Ohio were these 5, and again, they form a linguistic subdivision. Mouth of the Ohio separation occurred. The Ohio, wrong click, there we go, forms, so I'm in Kentucky, I'm right up here, and we've got the Ohio River as part of our border. It empties into the Mississippi, which is right there, and the connection is that point. It's sort of at the southern tip of Illinois. So that tells us at some point these various plains groups west of the Mississippi at contact were once east of the Mississippi and separated down there. Interesting. There is another clue in this quote that gives us temporal precision. The Illinois tribes named them. So apparently, east of the Mississippi, they encountered the Illinois. The Illinois must have been in existence, and after being named by the Illinois, they separated. Why does that matter? In previous episodes, the Illinois, who are part of the Algonquian subgroup of the Algic language family, we've got a date for their formation. This is a long, complicated diagram, which I derived, again, earlier in this series. The Illinois are right there, and I think the Miamis are part of this particular diagram. But the point is, they're part of this linguistic subgroup of the Algonquans. They're the 5th division. That means something in the context of a previous episode, and the date for their origin is the late 1300s. So apparently, the Omahas, Poncaws, Osages, Kansas, and Kapaws were east of the Mississippi, along the Ohio, at least in the earlier 1300s, and their separation must post-date 1370s. Let's add that to the map. So this date does not come from the Sioux and Catawbans. It comes from their interaction with the Algic or Algonquins. And what we're going to see shortly is what the Siouans themselves say about the date, and that's where it gets interesting. The Iowas, Otos, Missouris. Okay, so just in case you didn't notice this, what I've just told you, there's a bit of an inconsistency. The Omahs and the Poncaws, I've got 2 arrows from them. One, at one point they were with the Winnebagos, and it says they came from the north, they crossed the Mississippi. Another source says they came from this direction. So that earlier quote, they were with the Winnebagos, they came from the north, yet we've just seen that they also talk about dwelling east of the Mississippi with this other group, and there's a separation at the mouth of the Ohio. So perhaps what these 2 sources are implying is a complicated history of times of separation together, separated together, and there's more migrations back and forth than this fully captures. And I'm not going to dismiss these accounts because I can't resolve this, but I want you to be aware of it because there's history here that I think is accessible. I don't have it all solved, but that may be one solution. They drove other tribes before them. I want to add this to the map as well. Move that green spot because we know they were along the Ohio, so the Ohio goes all the way back this direction, so it could have been even further east. That's getting us closer to the Atlantic and perhaps to the Eastern Seaboard in 81,000 when the Pilgrims could have arrived. That's what we're trying to consider. I'm putting another circle here for other tribes, whoever they were, but it's a clue to recover the larger pre-Columbian history of North America. And at the Ohio, the separation occurred. Now, when did that occur? What did the Sioux and Catawbans say about the time of the separation at the Ohio? The Poncas say that they had 7 old men, Poncas being Sioux and Catawban. 7 old men since they became a separate tribe. Presumably, they became a separate tribe at the mouth of the Ohio when they went their separate ways from their linguistic relatives. Osages, and others. Under the 5th Old Man, they first saw the Palefaces, Europeans. They are now under the 7th Old Man. The Omahas, according to some of their tribe, are now under their 5th Old Man. Among the Dakotas, according to some authorities, an Old Man denotes a cycle of 70 years or more. So Dorsey goes on to say, 1886, if the Poncas use the term in this sense and are correct in doing so, they may have had a tribal existence for about 490 or 500 years. And subtracting that from 1886, when Dorsey is writing, this would extend back as far as AD 1390 or 1380. So they became a nation, separate group, 1390, 1380. Presumably that's at the mouth of the Ohio when they separate. So the Sioux and Catawbans put the date of the separation about 1380, 1390, which is right around what we've just said, based on the Algic, saying, hey, the Illinois didn't come into existence about the late 1300s, so them being named that and then separating from the Illinois must have happened post that date. These two independent accounts agree. And again, tell me, if these are fake, if these are mythological, why do I get such incredible temporal precision and agreement? It's a testament, I think, to the veracity of these accounts. There's one more line of evidence I want to bring up, though, that tells me this is on the right track. We've talked in previous episodes, again, about this greatest city north of the Rio Grande in the pre-Columbian era, Cahokia. If you're migrating, if you're the Sioux and Catawbans and you're migrating from the east to the west, and Cahokia is right here, and there, we've seen in previous episodes, the rulers of the east, they've got an empire that covers much of the eastern territory, likely the Mississippian culture. The chieftains expand with time, and you're going eastward, and you're going to try to keep going eastward, you're going to run into a buzzsaw. What we've seen, though, is that, and the reason I give you the dates 1050 to 1250 is the Algics came along and overthrew the Cahokians in 1250, late 1200s. So that, wrong button. If you're migrating a century earlier, you may have trouble. But if you're migrating close to where Cahokia once was, and it's the late 1300s, you don't have that buzzsaw. So there's another line of evidence to support these dates. It fits. You have earlier dates, you've got the problem of this massive enemy and empire. 1300s, they don't exist. That empire is gone, been overthrown. There's remnants of it down here, Mississippian culture. But the power they once held, you don't find it. So all that, I think, agrees. Testament to the veracity of these accounts. Let's keep building our picture because we're getting closer to the Atlantic. Does it actually take us all the way there? From the book Joseph Medicine Crow wrote in 92, From the Heart of Crow Country, the Crow Indians' Own Stories, he says, it is said that in the long, long ago times, the ancestral tribes of the Hidatsa and Crows, and remember they're part of the same linguistic subdivision, once lived towards the east in the Tree Country, now believed to be the western end of the Great Lakes, say south of Lake Superior and west of Lake Michigan. And if you're looking close at the map, you'll notice we hadn't drawn any arrows for the Crows and Hidatsas and Mandans. We now can. They also came from the east. I mentioned Hidatsa and Crow, didn't mention Mandan, but the Mandans have something to say as well. This is from, I think, an 1800s document translated and published in 1900s. Prince Maximilian, he said, the early history of the Mandans is involved in obscurity. However, notice this, they affirm that they descend originally from the more eastern nations near the seacoast. And Amos One-Road, along with Allenson Skinner, 2003 book, Being Dakota, Tales and Traditions of the Sisseton and Wahpeton, who are also Sioux. The Eastern Dakota claim that the Sioux originated in the north, and what we'll see here is that's different from the Winnebago's north. This is a separate north, and came south until somewhere to the southeast of their starting point. They were stopped by the ocean, where they scattered and went in different directions. So wherever north is, they went from there southeast and were stopped by the ocean. So north, southeast, and boom, they're at the ocean. That gets us to the Eastern Seaboard. And they scattered. He goes on to say they fought many tribes and finally grew stronger, and then traveled northwestward toward the prairie. When they reached Minnesota and eastern South Dakota, they came upon the Cheyenne, whom they drove onto the prairie. So map out that migration. They were once at the ocean, and then eventually northwestward to Minnesota. And then here's another clue. The Cheyenne are Algonquian language family members. When did the Cheyenne originate? We have the answer to that based on previous work, previous episodes. They're on this map. We can put a date on the origin of the Cheyenne and their relatives, the Potawatomi. Mid-1200s. So as this group is going eastward and hitting the Mississippi and Cahokia, there's a group that separates. Again, the previous episode goes into much more detail. So the Cheyenne didn't exist until after the 1240s, 1250s maybe, which perhaps means that the Dakotas may not have arrived up there until post-1250s. We can add that to our map. The Cheyenne were neighbors. At contact, they're on the plains, but they talk about having come from the east. And we can put a date on it. So this interaction must have happened post-1240, 1250, and perhaps kind of generally fits the timeline of when these groups were moving eastward. So they're coming from the ocean. Presumably as one group's the Dakota subgroup, the Chewewe, the Dagia subgroups of the language families haven't yet formed. They're in the process and separating as they're going westward and run into some of these Algic language family members. Now, when were some of these groups at the Atlantic on the ocean? Clark, 1885, says the Poncas claim that the Omahas, Osages, Kaws, or Kapaws, and 2 or 3 other tribes a long time ago lived with them and spoke the same vocal language. I could not definitely trace their migrations. I think he's talking about the later migrations where they separate in post-Mississippi. He does say this, though. Big Bull, one of the headmen, said his grandfather told him that in olden times, when the above-named tribes were with them, they lived near the Atlantic Ocean, and in their westward migrations became separated. That fits. So we can add another line here. These guys don't just go to the Ohio. They go all the way back to the Atlantic. And we can refine this even more. They started on this movement from near Washington, D.C. The Kaws and Osages coming across to Kansas, west of the Mississippi, and the Poncas and Omahas going farther north to northeastern Nebraska. And I don't think I've captured it here, but there's more details to what was going on west of the Mississippi. But our larger question is, how do we get to the eastern part? Is there a connection to the eastern part? Yes, even to the point of D.C., and they go westward and separate. Again from Clark, he says, the Santee Sioux claim that formerly their old men kept a record of events by tying knots in a long string. By the peculiar way of tying them and by other marks, they denoted the different events, fights, etc., and even smaller matters such as births of children and so on. I once saw a slender pole, some 6 feet in length, the surface of which was completely covered with small notches, and the old Indian who possessed it assured me that it had been handed down from father to son for many generations, and that these notches represented the history of his tribe for over 1,000 years. In fact, went back to the time when they lived near the ocean. The publication, again, date for this was 1885. You subtract 1,000 years, gets you to AD 885, and he says it's over 1,000 years, so it could have been even earlier. This tells us that this long migration path has a date at the Atlantic in the AD 800s. And that's where my information stops. I've been basing this all I'm not native by descent. I've just been looking at the old literature, what's publicly available, and this is how much history is available for those who actually want to go looking. If you don't dismiss the indigenous histories as mythological, but you take it as truth, this fascinating set of events and migrations, this dynamic history is what emerges. Could these Sioux and Catawbans have not only been at the Atlantic, and of course they would have been north, pre-AD 800, could they have been in Ohio and build the mounds of the Hopewell culture? Could they have been in 1000 BC down in Poverty Point, Louisiana, building those mounds? I don't have information publicly available, but there's ways to go exploring this, which I'll get to in a moment. So, this is not New England, but if the Pilgrims had landed in 81,000 somewhere along the Eastern Seaboard, there's a good chance they would have run into the ancestors of people like Red Cloud and Sitting Bull, because their own histories take them back to the Atlantic Ocean centuries prior. Who might the Pilgrims have seen? Not the Algonquans, not the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, but a high chance they would have run into the ancestors of these great warriors from the 1800s. So you think of the Sioux as on the plains, fine. 1,000 years prior to 1800, in AD 800, they're in the woodlands and on the seashore. Before then, that's something I want to explore. Before then, could they have been connected to the mound builders? I think there's a good way we can find out. I've got a project ongoing, Native American History Project, and so if you're Native American descent, this is an episode that's been heavily on the Sioux and Catawban, but this is a project that extends to all the North American Native Americans and First Nations, U.S. and Canada. We're eventually going to hopefully connect to Mexico and Latin America because there's indigenous histories that do. Previous episodes talk about this. First step, though, in this project is, do you have more indigenous histories? I'm just Caucasian American, looking at what's publicly available and taking it as written, but perhaps there's more I've missed. I would love to be able to reconstruct more of this history. My larger goal is that every school child in America grows up different than I did. I grew up ignorant of all this. There was Europeans who arrived. These are the peoples they encountered and had nothing to go on as to what transpired. I grew up being taught European history and to respect it and to know the names and the places and the battles. No such equivalent for the pre-Columbian North America. I don't want kids to grow up that way. I want them to know what happened, the great heroes, the events, the battles, and to gain respect for what transpired so they're not ignorant of those who remain. Step one in understanding this, filling out more of this history, is even more indigenous histories. So I've mentioned the Sioux. I've shown you how far I could get just with what's out there. Perhaps there's more I've missed. I'll tell you how you can get in touch with me. Would love to know more. And again, even though we're focused on the Sioux, there's the whole continent I'm trying to understand. I've gotten stuck with, in particular, the Iroquoian language family. The Cherokees are part of this. I can't find a good source on what they say is their origins migration. So if you belong to one of those nations, would love to get in touch with you. On the west coast of the U.S. and Canada, again, I feel like I've gotten stuck trying to find the histories. I've gotten in touch with some of you there. I think there's a lot more history to be recovered. But again, we're talking continent-wide. Any groups would love to know if there's indigenous histories to build it out further. The second arm of this project is if you're a Native American male. So you can say, okay, my father and his father and his father and his father, all the way back as far as you know, were Native Americans. There's a good chance you have a male inherited Y chromosome that is indigenous. It's a weird sort of genetic test. For technical reasons, this is just kind of what we're stuck with. But there's been some huge advances we've been able to make with it. Like I said, we've been able to connect a particular branch to the Algic language family. There's history embedded in that DNA we can recover, and the history tends to agree with the indigenous history, which is very exciting to me. So we've got about 25 candidates so far from a variety of nations, men who can say, yeah, dad, grandfather, granddad, and so great-grandfather, and so on backwards, native. They'd be good candidates. We're trying to get up to 100 men. I've got contacts now in about 30 to 35 different Native American nations here in North America. Want to see that grow as well, which leads me to the third arm of this project. So men or women. So it's just men for that second arm, just for technical reasons. I'd love to get the female genetics side, but there's been statistical hurdles I haven't been able to solve. Maybe one day I will be able to. Men or women for this third arm, my thought is if I walk into the Native American nations, and I need to get the permissions to be able to do this sort of work. I walk into a Native American reservation and say, I'd like to do this research, understand more of this history. They're going to say, who are you? What do you want? You're some tall Caucasian. Go away. However, if there's a large group of Native Americans themselves who say, no, we want to know our history, would you consider giving permission for this project? I think there's a greater chance of it getting approved. So men or women, if you'd like to just simply be an advocate, please get in touch with me. So all of you, and just to clarify, we're not a government organization. We don't get government funds. We're a private Christian nonprofit. If you want to get in touch with me, you go to our website, answersingenesis.org/go/traced. Traced is from a book I published last year. I'll tell you about in a minute. It'll take you to a page that looks like this. You can click on the link there, Hidden History of Every People Project, which will take you down, or just scroll down to the page to a place to enter your name, email, I think phone number as well. If you get a phone number from a Boston area code, it's likely me calling from my cell. I'll probably email you first from my Answers in Genesis email. We can correspond directly. These messages go directly to my inbox. Again, this is one in a series of episodes on North American Native American history. You can find more on our website, answersandgenesis.org. The links will be in the subscription. It'll take you to this playlist. It looks like this. Another way to get in touch with me is on social media. I've got a number of accounts because I don't know which one I'll get kicked off of. So find me that way as well. It's a way to keep abreast of news. When new episodes come out, I tend to announce it there. The book that I referred to just a few minutes ago is this book, Traced. It focuses on the global history of humanity based on genetics and especially the Y chromosome. There is a chapter on Native American history. We've got a video series, a separate playlist for this book's history as well. Episode 3 in that series deals with the Native American pre-Columbian chapter and covers some of what I just mentioned. A lot of that research was instigated and was begun to be developed in a series of videos we also did in 2020, New History of the Human Race, in again on Answers in Genesis, separate playlist. I've got a book I published in 2017 dealing with a larger creation evolution issue called Replacing Darwin. Sort of the Cliff Notes version of this is Replacing Darwin Made Simple, small booklet. You can find that summarized in our lecture that you can find in DVD, or if you subscribe to our streaming channel, answers.tv. Massive amount of information there, with videos I've done as well. We are also the ministry that has the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter here in northern Kentucky, the two of them about 45 minutes apart, where we apply some of this history. This, again, has been episode 4, The Lost History of North America, trying to understand what the Pilgrims may have seen had they arrived several centuries earlier in AD 1000 and celebrated Thanksgiving then. My name is Nathaniel Jeanson. This is The Lost History of North America. Join us again next time as we uncover more of this mystery and try to recover what transpired on this continent before Europeans arrived. Thank you very much.